good morning, good afternoon,
Good morning.
good evening,
Yes.
good day to everyone out there watching. It's great to be here on this live with you all.
It's another
Right,
lovely
Greg?
weekend.
About to
And-
be. It's Friday today, but it feels,
Yeah.
You know.
I always mush Friday in with the weekend. I like to do that.
yeah, I think some people even start from Thursday.
Yeah.
Where they start getting into that weekend
If you start
mode.
the week, if you end the week with Saturday and the start of the week is Sunday for you, then you get to call Friday part of the weekend.
Yeah, for us, since we work every single day, we don't really have
Yeah,
weekends.
to be honest, there's no such thing as weekend at
Yeah.
Explearning, but that's okay.
But that's okay. That's the way
Yeah.
we want it. So
What's our topic today?
today, our topic is what makes a good manager. Specifically, what are the aspects, what are the skills that good managers seem to possess, and ideals that they espouse,
Right.
and things
Right.
like that.
Yeah, that's a great topic.
Yeah, so earlier we put out a video about managing remote teams.
Yep.
So today we're talking about managing skills in general, be it managing remote teams or IRL in real life when you're in the same space as your team
Right.
and as your colleagues.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap between those two.
Definitely.
Because obviously when you're working remotely, you still need to manage, right?
Right.
And just so we're clear off from the outset, just because you're managing a team doesn't mean you're a manager, doesn't mean you're the at the top of the rung here. There's management that goes on at every level
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
a team, right? Including the people that are sort of at the base, at the foundation. Even they need to manage their colleagues and then manage up to their, the people above them, the people that are senior to them.
Absolutely.
So this word management, I think often people get scared away because like, well, I'm not a manager, so
Yeah.
I'm just
That's
going
true.
to tune out here.
Right. Even if you don't have the title in your job description
Exactly.
or your job title.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't have to be in your job description, and it doesn't have to be in, what people consider you to be. At the end of the day, though, management is all about team dynamics, right? And managing workflow, keeping things moving in an efficient and productive way.
Right.
And everyone is responsible for that. Yes, the manager technically is the one who's calling all the shots, but at the end of the day, it takes management at all levels for a team to be successful.
Absolutely. And like you said, Greg, you can be a manager at different times of your career and different points of your career and different projects. For example, maybe someone asks you to spearhead a project, right? In that case, you assume the role of manager for that specific project. So it can even be on the micro level as well.
Yeah, I think you
right?
can. I totally agree with that. I think you can get even more micro, which is it can within a project at certain times you can be the manager, right? So it can be a situation where it's a multifaceted project, but there's a specific point where your expertise is critical to the project's success.
Right.
At that point, you may be called on to step up and manage that part of the project.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of where even if you're not the manager for that project on paper,
Right.
there may be aspects of the project where you need to step up and lead.
Exactly. So today we're going to talk about a couple of points that we should be cognizant of when we are a manager, when we're in a managerial role, when we are spearheading a project, that kind of thing, when you take on the role of someone who is managing a group of people or a project.
Yeah, great.
Right?
And good morning, Verns. We were so happy to have you on the
that was
premiere.
awesome. Yeah, thanks so
We're
much for
delighted to have
joining.
you
It was
again.
really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
One of the things that's really important, and we talk about this a lot because it is part of communication, is listening, right? And so when you're in a managerial role, what you're really doing is you're listening for their specific needs, maybe any grievances the team has, any concerns about due dates, project load, anything like that. You're really listening for feedback and what sort of they are receptive to, right? So that's a big one, the listening portion of the communication equation.
exactly. And we talk a lot about the importance of listening in the process of communication because, again, when people communicate, they typically think about that they're the ones, speaking,
Right.
right? You think of speaking. If you ask someone what is communication, the first thing that would come to mind is probably someone talking.
Right.
But the other half of the equation, of course, is the listening, and
We can't overlook it.
you can't overlook it,
Yeah.
and particularly in leadership, this is important because again, when people think of leaders too, they think of someone giving a speech, right? And
At a podium.
At a podium, right?
Yeah,
And sort of
exactly.
directing everyone.
Right.
But effective leaders need to listen. Effective leaders are paying attention to the team dynamics and understanding how to respond to the current context.
Yeah.
And that's very important. You know, when we were talking about in the video that you put out about remote management.
Yeah.
And it's really important, really across any sort of communication channel, any context. You need to be paying attention to what it is that the team is saying, what their needs are, what their concerns are, and you know where they're tracking on their progress. And all of that requires listening.
Yeah.
Because if all you do is give the orders, the instructions, then you know you're not necessarily going to get the follow through that you're looking for. You can say a bunch of things, but you know if you've ever been in a position where you've been at the helm, you'll know that saying something and it getting done are two very different things. There's a whole phrase for it, right? Easier said than done.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, that basically sums up what we're talking about
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Easier said than done.
Yeah.
So when you listen, you start to understand and you're keyed into that done part of the equation. Is it done yet? And if it's not done, why is it not done? Right? What are the barriers? What obstacles are in between you and getting that done, between the team and getting that done?
Right. So asking these, follow-up questions, making sure that they'll feel comfortable enough to tell you what's going on, and if the workload is manageable, if the due dates are outrageously, if they're too close to, the
Right, too aggressive.
too aggressive, or if there's any issue with, I don't know, like another team that you're working with. So it's really important to have that open dialogue, that open communication, so that you allow people to come up to you and say, well, this is what's not really working that well, or this is what's going really well, right? It can also be the positive sides of things too.
Yeah,
right?
I like that you brought up other teams, because that's another very important aspect of this equation. Often when we think of managing a project, you think of one team, and one team can be very organized and very well equipped to work with each other. Maybe they've done a bunch of projects, they're a finely tuned machine. But it can get a lot harder when you start to combine different teams. But in reality, that is quite common to have multiple teams engaged on a larger project, because different teams have different expertise, and so you often bring them in. And that's where things can get really hard, because you know how your team operates and functions,
Right.
and you're very cued into the personalities of the people working on the team, and the dynamics. When you start talking about other teams that you haven't spent as much time with, that can get a lot more complicated, and the listening part of it becomes even more important, because it's one thing, if you're communicating with someone, your spouse, your partner, your family members, you kind of know half of what they're saying even before they say it.
Yeah.
And without listening to the words, right? You're so used to sort of communicating with them in using all aspects of communication, not just what they're saying. When you start to interact with people that you're less familiar with, that you interact with less frequently, that's where you need to spend a little more effort actually understanding what it is they're saying.
Right.
You can't infer. You don't want to assume. You want clarity. And the only way to get clarity is by asking the questions you're saying,
Right.
And listening to what they're saying. So going back to what we were just discussing, when you are involved in a situation where there are multiple teams, that's a good signal that you need to step up the listening to another level, because you're going to be interacting with people that you're not as used to interacting with.
Right. And full listening, not just listening to their words, but also their nonverbals, their tone of voice, without making assumptions, like you said, Greg, because that's really important especially when you're not familiar with someone's communication style. You have to get used to how people are expressing themselves and how they're managing and that kind of thing. So that open communication is essential.
Yeah, you also find, I think, that when you start to operate and interact with different teams, you get this interesting dynamic where each team is going to be very supportive of the people within the team, and protective even of people within the team.
Good point.
Right, and there's this wonderful phrase where you have these different circles of camaraderie, of affiliation, right? So you and your sibling might squabble, right?
Right.
But if your cousin comes in and hits your sibling with a stick, then
You'll go
you and your
after
sibling are suddenly fast friends, and you go after your cousin, right? Okay, now you have your siblings and your cousin together, and you guys are squabbling. But then someone from outside, right? So a neighbor,
a school next door,
right? A neighbor comes over and hits your cousin with a stick. Suddenly, your sibling, and your cousin are all fast friends, and you're going against the neighbor. And then, from there you go to someone from a different state, or someone from a different country, right? Or someone from a different planet.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say that. That's funny.
So the point is, there's these, you feel a strong sense of affiliation with the people that you are on the team with. And the context of a team can really vary. In a corporate context, right, you can have your very specific team that you work with daily. And then when you're working with other teams, there might be some potential friction there, and defensiveness between teams that you need to be aware of. But sometimes also you have multiple teams in a company, but then you might be working with a client, right?
Yeah.
So an external client from a different company. So there, suddenly everyone in the company is sort of defensive of each other versus the client, right? And then, God forbid, you have multiple clients or multiple partners, often in a banking situation, right? In a merger or acquisition, you'll have 5 or 6 different banks, 5 or 6 different law firms, right? And several consultants, along with the companies involved, all trying to interact together.
And they all have their own way of doing things. They have their own communication styles, their communication codes, the way that they run things over there.
Yeah. And it's so easy in these sort of diverse, homogenous, or heterogeneous environments for there to be miscommunication.
Right.
And almost always it comes back to, were people listening to each other? And like you were saying, not only are they listening, but are they comprehending? And if they're not comprehending, are they pursuing comprehension through follow-up questions, through clarifying questions?
It kind of makes you think of one of the scenes in Battlestar Galactica where Admiral Adama, he's like the manager of...
Yeah, well, he's the captain of the ship.
The admiral.
He's the admiral of the fleet.
Right. He used to be captain. Then he got promoted.
The military terms are confusing, but you can be both the captain of a ship and an admiral. Right. Because you can be admiral of multiple ships.
Right. So he was captain at the time, but basically everyone treated him as like admiral level. And then another fleet comes in, more senior. What was her name? Admiral...
I can't
remember. Anyways, so another fleet comes in, and now the admiral is like the big kahuna. She's like the boss.
Exactly.
So they butt heads a little bit.
Right, because Captain Adama, he used to be, or Admiral Adama,
the head honcho.
He used to be the head guy.
Yeah.
And then suddenly someone else comes in, and
she's more
senior to him.
Yeah, she's senior.
Yeah. And they have to figure out, how do you negotiate these power dynamics?
Right. And like, do you listen to that person? Because Admiral Adama was making really good points. And this is where stakes are really high. They're in outer space.
Right.
They're looking for a habitable planet.
Yeah. There's only some, 30,000 humans left.
Yeah. Alien raiders are after them.
Yeah.
Lots of things going on. So decisions are really important to make the right decisions under a lot of pressure. So what do you do in the situation where it's not clear who is the manager, right? That's a really tough one, where you might have a team, you have a clear manager, everything's going, it's all peaches, swimmingly. And then you have another team that comes in because you need to collaborate with them, which is a beautiful thing, collaboration. But now it's not really clear. Now Team A's cohort, let's say, is not clear to, as to how they are supposed to, like, if they take commands.
Yeah, take command.
from, team A's manager or team B's manager, or is it a hybrid of both managers'
Yeah.
styles? And
one of the most important things to establish, and the military has a way of dealing with this, is a clear hierarchy, right?
Right.
Who's in charge of what?
Yes.
And that's really important in teams. And it doesn't have to always be the same person for everything, right? You can have one person in charge of X and another person in charge of Y. The key is that there's clarity on who's in charge, right?
That's key.
And in the military, the way it works is there's just a chain of command. And the reason why it actually worked out all right in the Battlestar Galactica situation, because Adama very responsibly said, this woman is senior to me.
And he deferred
to
her.
And I'll defer to her.
Yeah.
And that's the chain of command. In an office, it can get tricky, particularly when you have a bunch of junior people working together.
Right.
Right? It's one thing, you all know that the managing director is the managing director, right? But you have a bunch of associates and they're all at the same level. If they're working together, who's going to take the lead there?
Right.
And that's challenging. And
it is.
One of the best things you can do is early on in the project, establish who's going to lead what. And actually my business school training, one of the first things they did was take the whole cohort of colleagues, and they broke us all into small teams, 4 or 5 people.
Right.
And there was no hierarchical difference between us, right? All students are equal. Yet at the same time, we needed to establish some sense of hierarchy in order to be efficient with getting things done. Right. And it's not about who's the boss. It's more about just making sure that everything gets done. And so it's really about who's the owner of what. Right. And it's not necessarily who's going to call all the shots, but it's, all right, who's responsible for this part of the project?
Exactly.
Who's responsible for this? Really clear roles goes a very long way.
Definitely.
Toward establishing, an effective and efficient operation.
Right.
Now, when it comes to making actual decisions, go, no go, that can be a bit trickier.
That's really hard, especially when the stakes are so high and so many people depend on you.
Right. And at that point, I think nothing's more effective than having an open conversation with the people around you to understand, what are our priorities?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And what is most aligned with those priorities?
And also mitigating the effects of groupthink, because again, in these like-minded groups where you're with people that you're very familiar with, you work well together, we are harmonious by default, actually, believe it or not. Humans want to veer towards harmony, right? Instead of discordance. And so
Absolutely.
Groupthink is something that actually comes natural to us, which is actually something we need to be mindful of, because in these big, high stakes meetings with a lot of people depending on you to make the right decision, it's easy to make the decision from the person's, who's the loudest in the room.
Right. And just so we're clear, groupthink in this context is basically going with what the group says, we should go with.
Right.
It's like like you're saying, the loudest voice says something. And then everyone around that person decides, well, I don't want to shake the boat,
rock the
ship.
boat. Right.
And so
that sounds good. That's fine.
It's easier to just agree with them.
Right. And they say it with such confidence and gusto and authority most of the time that you feel so compelled to say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, without even thinking of the alternatives, which might even be better options.
Right. Yeah, people prefer to be non-confrontational. There are people who are by nature confrontational, and that can have its drawbacks as well.
Right.
But in general, in a group situation, there's this tendency to be non-confrontational, particularly when you go to Eastern cultures.
Oh,
but
that's
you see it a lot in the U.S. too. You see it a
Yeah.
lot in the U.S. too. And the problem with that is you end up, the group ends up going with a decision that wasn't necessarily the best decision. It was just the one that was verbalized first, or was spoken with
such confidence,
with the most confidence or charisma.
Yeah.
Right. All of these things were very
compelling.
We're very susceptible to being swayed by. And so I think you brought up 2 very important parts of the management equation. One is detecting groupthink.
Yes.
Right. And 2 is making sure all the voices are heard.
Yes.
And again, this doesn't require a head honcho to ensure it happens. going back to our my business school sort of group teams.
Yeah.
Even within those, again, there was no specific leader, but we made a very concerted effort to ensure that everyone had an opportunity to voice their views.
That's really
Sometimes
good.
you don't have an opinion, and
Yeah,
you
and
don't
in
have to
that
say
case,
anything.
yeah.
But if you do, you don't want to feel that pressure to just conform with the group. If you have an opposing opinion, you want to be able to express that opinion.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be confrontational about
No.
it, right? You can do it in a very professional and considerate way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very important to voice those opinions. So as the manager, you want to make sure people are expressing their opinions. And as a participant in that group sort of situation,
Mm-hmm.
you want to make sure that if you have an opinion that's contrary or even supportive of what's being discussed, that you voice it.
Yeah.
Right?
It's important to find the courage to speak up if you have something to say, of course, not to, speak when you don't have anything to say. Didn't Aristotle, I think it was Aristotle that said, if you don't have anything to say, silence is always better. It's something like that. I'm paraphrasing.
Right, exactly.
But it's something like that, where we shouldn't shy away from silence if we don't have anything to add of value. But when we do have something to add of value, then speak up, right? And do it in a nice way, a non-confrontational way, thinking of it as like an add-on to elaborate on what something said, as opposed to, defying them or butting heads with them.
Yeah,
right?
One of my favorite ways to basically confront an opposing opinion
Yeah.
is to frame what I'm about to say in the context of the larger goal. And we touched on this just a little bit earlier. When you have a clear goal, it's then a very useful tool for presenting your opinions, your views on a situation, right? So if I disagree with something that someone else said, what I can say is not, you're wrong, I disagree with you. Instead, I would phrase it as, so our ultimate goal is this. In my mind, in order to achieve that goal, this is the direction we should take. If we take that other direction, I don't think it's going to get us to the goal, and here is why, right? So you frame everything in the context of the goal. You sort of depersonalize it. It's not an attack on the other person.
No.
You're just simply framing what you believe to be the best approach in the context of reaching that goal.
Exactly.
And that's a very compelling and non-confrontational way to present an opposing opinion.
Absolutely. The other thing that I've found in just the managers that I have had over the years, over the course of my career prior to Explearning, was that the good managers knew the strengths and the weaknesses of all the people on his or her team. So what's really great about that and why that's a strength as a manager, I find, and I want to hear what you think, Greg, and also the Explearners out there, what you think. When you are a manager who can identify the strengths and the weaknesses of team members, you're more able to assign someone to a role or to a project more easily and more effectively, I think, so that that, let's say Jake is really good with graphic design and you have a project that's really heavy in graphic design. Well, then who are you going to assign? Probably Jake. You're going to make sure Jake's on that team, right? And if, let's say, Janelle is really good at communicating with clients, well, then you're going to definitely have Janelle communicate with the clients on that,
role.
right?
Right.
So I think that that's an important part of being a good manager. What do you think?
Understanding sort of the competencies of your team, the composition of your team.
And where they really shine.
Yeah, definitely. And, I keep bringing up the same example.
Okay, tell us again. Why not?
Again, in that group that we had at business school, there was, again, 5 of us. We had different aptitudes. One guy was a former management consultant at McKinsey, and this guy could put together spreadsheets like you can't believe.
Wow.
Another worked at a technology firm and was very good at bringing in different platforms to help sort of make our work more efficient, and was very good at sort of using project management tools to keep us on track.
That's good.
Right? And so knowing what different people are good at, I agree, is a huge advantage to an effective team and putting people to work.
Yeah.
One of the things I loved about my boss at my previous company was he was really good at figuring out who was good at what. When I joined that company, the first role I had was a sales role, right? So I was on the phone all day calling people, trying to get them to use our product. And it only took him one day. I was an intern at the time. It took him one day to figure out that this was not my
forte.
My forte, right? The next day he's like, you know what? We're actually working on this mobile app as well. Do you want to help us design that?
I'm only laughing because I know Greg very well, and he's the least salesy type of person.
I hate sales. It's a very important function. It's so important, and it's really hard to do well. I'm not the person for it.
Without being like salesy. Do you know what I mean?
It's really tough to do. So anyways, instead he put me on a role that I actually excelled at, right? Building apps is something that I hadn't done before, but he quickly saw that I was good at and, you know, had the skills for it. Yeah. So him knowing who was good at what allowed him to operate what became a very profitable business.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've always admired his abilities there.
Yeah, so it's an important skill to have.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And so it's when, you know, to put that into action, when you're on a team, it also it's also worth spending some time to figure out who's good at what, right?
And getting to know the people on your team really well and learning, you know, what their passions are, what makes them, you know, tick in a good way. And then in terms of, you know, their weaknesses, how can you address those? How can you help them, you know, improve upon the skills that they seek to improve upon or would benefit from improving upon? And so identifying those areas for improvement in the form of offering, you know, like professional development, a stipend or like courses or things like that, or giving them resources that you found to be helpful for maybe, let's say, your own journey, things like that. Just not, you know, letting those weaknesses fall by the wayside, but also encouraging them to, you know, pursue what can also help them progress in different aspects. Yeah, personal or professional development, right?
Definitely. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. It's not always just about what they're good at, you know? It's also about what do they enjoy doing. Because going back to my previous job, it's funny to call this a job. It doesn't feel like a job. It's not really a job. But that previous one was a job. And
depends on how you define job.
Right,
like Elizabeth Gilbert, let's just give a little tangent for a second. She was talking about the difference
Let's say
between...
that. Let's say it's a great one.
Yeah, all right, we'll save that for another time.
Because we're running short on time. That's a really good one. Remind me.
Okay.
Elizabeth Gilbert, if you're on our next live,
hold us accountable.
There's a really good breakdown of job versus everything else. It's a great one. But the point is simply, there were some things I was good at. I was great at putting together PowerPoint presentations, but I hated putting together PowerPoint presentations.
I love putting together
and my boss knew I hated it. And so he'd still have me do it sometimes when it was really important.
Yeah.
But he made a big effort to make sure I was also working on things. I like to build things, to build models, right? And to
build programs and software.
And that kind of thing. So he would definitely cultivate that side of me.
Which is good.
Well, sometimes also have me do the things I didn't like to do.
If there's a need, you know.
For the business, you know, you got to do what's best for the business.
You have to step up in different aspects. So yeah, it's all really interesting, right? Thinking about ways, again, even if you're not necessarily a manager or even a natural, like a born leader, there's a leader in all of us. We just have to figure out what we can help people, how we can lead people, and how we can inspire and, you know, cultivate that passion in people for, you know, doing great things. Why not, right?
Yeah. So I think that about wraps up this segment.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about.
We could talk for like 5 hours, probably. I don't think anyone would watch a 5-hour live stream.
I have to say, Vernge has been on point with a lot of her comments too.
Awesome.
And it's great to have you so involved. And,
thank you.
We'd love to get the rest of the community involved too.
Yeah.
But, I think you're stepping up and showing people.
Thank you, Vern.
Yeah. Thank you for adding in. And look, there's a lot more to talk about on this topic. We will be talking about these topics more.
Yeah. Let us know what other things you want us to talk about, right? A lot of what we do comes from the feedback we receive from you all in terms of what you need guidance with. And so we'd like to help you know, provide some resources to help you do that.
Yeah, communications and social skills is a very broad topic very broad subject, and there's a lot under that.
Productivity too,
Productivity
right?
too, yeah.
We love all
So-
that stuff.
Yeah. Anyways,
All right.
thanks for joining us
Thank
on
you.
this lovely Friday.
Yes, and we will see you next week. So
Yes.
stay tuned. The lesson will be going out, and also we'll have another live coming at you. So just watch keep an eye on our channel page, and you'll see what's going on.
Great.
All right.
Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you,
Catch
and
you next time.
happy exploring.